Okay. Let's see. Why are you crying?
You don't love me anymore.
What? I love you.
No, you don't. You want to get rid of me.
No, I don't want to get rid of you. You just don't fit me the way that you're sewn together. So I'm going to make you into something much better.
You want to take me apart?
Aw, don't be like that. It's going to be great. You're going to look fantastic when you're done. Hello, and welcome to Tears of Joy Creative. That's right, it's finally time to turn this bias cut skirt into this very tailored jacket. Now, if you watched one of my previous videos on what was hiding in our sewing room closet, this skirt that's cut on the bias was hiding in mine. And I didn't like the way that it fit. It's too tight across my tummy, and I was going to try to shorten it from the top, and it really wasn't working. But I really liked the way this skirt is designed with all of these different pieces. So here's the plan. I'm going to take the front and back of this skirt apart and turn it so it's on the straight. And then I'm going to add fabric to it from other garments to make a piece of fabric so I can cut out all my pieces of the jacket. To this skirt, I found this really cool looking jacket from the thrift store, which I'm thinking I might just use as the sleeves for the jacket. I'm not sure how much patchwork I want to use in this garment. I also have this really cool textured dress, as you can see, with the cording. So there's definitely enough fabric in these three garments for the jacket. But I'm also going to be using this burgundy corduroy shirt, and I'm going to be using that for inside the pleat here, so it gives a pop of color, as well as the inner flap on the jacket. So if I'm wearing the jacket and it's open, you will see this color. I also have a couple pieces of fabric in my stash that I might be using as well. I have this really nice black wool with this great detail and just some plain gray wool. But I'm not sure how much of these I'm going to use. I would like this to be mostly an upcycled garment. But the only thing that I do have that I'm definitely going to be using that is not upcycled is this burgundy lining fabric to line the jacket with. So now, let's talk about this pattern here. This is Butterick number 4929. Now, I've never made this jacket before, so the first thing I've got to do is make a mock-up to see how this fits. This jacket is 4 main pieces: a front, a side front, a back, and a side back, along with a sleeve, the inner pleat, and the collar. And here's my mock-up. I think this fits pretty well, and I like it so far. Love the lines of the seams and the way it goes down into a point in the back. Can't wait to see that pop of red in the pleats when it's done. There are a couple of issues with the fit. My sleeves are way too tight. No way this will work with a lining and possibly another top underneath when I wear it, so I will have to cut the forearm bigger next time. And my arms are a bit trapped, so I need to lift the shoulders by about 1/2 inch. Then I will have more movement. Other than that, it fits well in the hips and in the waist. So here's my mock-up after lifting the shoulders 1/2 inch and letting out the sleeves. I have much better movement in my arms because lifting the shoulders brings the sleeve up into your armpit. So remember that the next time you're shopping for any jacket. Now, before I move on, I wanted to address something to all the beginner sewists out there who might be thinking that this pattern looks super complicated and there's no way that you could attempt a jacket like this. Well, I'm here to tell you that it's not that difficult and want to show you step by step the important details you need to know that will help you take on a project like this. So first, let's talk about how I cut out this pattern to get a good fit from the start. Because I am a size 12 in the bust, a 14 in the waist, and a 16 in the hips.
And that's exactly what I did when I cut out each piece. I followed the lines for a 12 in the bust area, gradually increased to a 14 in the waist, and then expanded out to a 16 in the hips. Now, it does not bother me one bit to cut up my patterns because I have been this size forever and I won't be making this pattern for anyone else. So let's watch that again. I follow the lines for a 12 in the bust, moved out to the 14 at the waist, and expanded out for a 16 in the hips.
And I would rather cut it that way versus cutting a size 16 to fit my largest area on my body and then tailor the jacket down to fit me in other areas. And cutting it this way does really make a difference because when you have, say, an 1/8 of an inch or a 1/4 of an inch times 8 pieces, that's a good inch, inch and a half that you're cutting down versus trying to make the garment and then pin it and then refit it and all that jazz. So for me, it's easier to cut the different sizes first and make small adjustments afterward, like I did when I lifted the shoulders a 1/2 inch and let out the sleeves. But for you, you might find a different technique that would work better for you, and maybe you want to draw everything out or trace the lines so that you're not cutting up your pattern. For me, it does not matter.
To cut this jacket out, I'm starting with the easiest pieces first from the burgundy corduroy shirt. I'm using the front of the shirt to cut the inner back pleats, the back of the shirt for the inner front of the jacket, and a sleeve for the collar. So I quickly realized once I had the skirt front and back taken apart and laid out on the table that all of these different sections that are sewn together are in different directions. And in order for me to use any of it, I have to take all the sections apart, turn them so that they're on the straight, and then sew them back together before I can start cutting out any of my jacket pieces.
One eternity later.
Well, I think I finally have this figured out. And here's what I've come up with. I'm going to use the skirt as the front of the jacket. So here's the front and the side front. What I have to do now is sew these pieces together in this order, and they're going to be identical for both sides. And then I can cut out the pieces. For the back of the jacket, I'm going to use a combination of the corded dress and the corded jacket with the flower because they go well together. I tried to mix in some of the corded dress with all of this, and it just clashed. And so I'm going to just keep it with the skirt on the front and the corded fabrics for the back. And for the sleeves, I believe I'm going to be able to kind of do a combination of both, but we'll see when we get there. I'm now going to start with this and sew all this together, make 2 of these, cut it all out, and go from there.
And this is what all that looks like now that it's all sewn together. And as you can see, I'm only sewing enough of the fabric together to cut out my pieces because I'm trying very hard to stretch this fabric as far as it will go. As I was cutting the front of the jacket out, I was very anxious to see what they were going to look like because all of this right now looks like a jigsaw puzzle gone wrong. And I was thrilled after lifting off the pattern to see the way these 2 pieces looked. Here's when I had an oh crap moment because as I was laying the side front next to the front, I realized I had just cut a side back piece. But never fear, I found that it was not off by that much, and it was easily fixed by adding a small piece to the bust area. And thankfully, I have only cut 1 side front so far, and no, I'm not worried about adding a little extra piece to the other side front so that they will match perfectly. I really don't think it's going to be that noticeable. But I am using these 2 pieces to cut the other side so that the layout of the sewn pieces will be symmetrical. And here's what that looks like. I am really happy with the way these look and can't wait to sew it all together. The back of the jacket was actually a bit more tricky than the front and took me a little while to figure out how to piece it together. I ended up piecing the jacket with flowers fabric and the corded dress fabric in a sort of half and half on the two pattern pieces, alternating the fabrics for a striped effect, like this. And I really like the way this turned out. And after staring at what fabric I had left over, I decided to continue this look for the sleeves because the pieces that were left from the skirt were just too small to piece together. It was going to be too much of a patchwork look, and I felt the front of the jacket was enough. But I did have enough of the black fabrics to cut the sleeves, and I do like the way they turned out. I also decided that I don't want the crown of the sleeve to be so gathered, so I'm cutting it down just a bit. This is something easy that you can do, and as long as you don't cut too much off, it won't affect the fit of the sleeve in your forearm. Finally, it's time to cut the lining pieces.
Well, after 2 long days of cutting all these pieces out, I now have to put on all of the markings. So I'm going to sit here for a little while and watch some YouTube, and then we'll be able to start the assembly.
Step 1. Sew a row of stay stitching above the waist and then attach the side front. But before I do that, I have gone ahead and serged off some of the edges because this wool fabric frays a lot. The row of stay stitching is there because you will need to clip the curve of the front side edge seam allowance to accommodate for the curve of the bust line on the side front piece. Otherwise, your seam allowance will pucker. Then I will serge off the edge before I press it. One tool I would highly recommend is a pressing ham. I have 2 different sizes, and they really help when pressing things like the bust seams because you are not flat. Your body has curves, and you want to press your seam allowance towards the side front. And then you're going to repeat the whole process all over again with the center back and side back pieces. Next is to sew down the center back seam to the marking just below the pleat extension. Then you will press open the center back seam and pleat extension on the fold line. And here is the jacket so far with the front and back all sewn together. Time to move on to the inner pleat detail. Basically, you sew the center seam together to the marking, press open the seam all the way down, then create the pleats and press them in place. Baste all the layers together. And then sew the side edges of the pleat to the extension edges at the center back of the jacket opening. And with the front and back now done, it's time to sew the shoulder and side seams together. Just remember to always sew the shoulders together starting at the armhole. These seams I'm going to press open because I want to avoid a lot of bulk. And I think it's time for a fitting just to see how this looks. I think this looks great. I'm really liking all the patterning and patchworking of the fabrics. And of course, I am now remembering that I was going to add pockets, but that's okay. They are an easy thing to add. So I have not talked much about interfacing, and here's why. The kind I used was very stiff and did not stay fused to the fabric. Maybe it's because it's old. I don't know. Is that even a thing? Fabric can go old? Sorry, I am not an expert when it comes to interfacing. I just know that it is a stabilizer and only 2 pieces in the jacket need it. It goes on one side of the collar and on the inner front. So instead, I'm using a lighter weight iron-on interfacing, and it seems to have stayed fused a lot better. To make the collar, you sew 3 sides together, trim the seam allowances and the corners, turn it right side out and press. And for stability, you want to sew the open side together. Now, to sew the collar onto the neckline, you need to sew a row of stay stitching on the neckline because you will need to clip the curve to make sure when you sew the collar on, your seam allowance will remain flat. And you want to have the interfaced side of the collar facing up, so when you turn it up after it's sewn on, it will be on the inside of the jacket against your neck. Time to add the sleeves, and I start by gathering the crown with 2 rows of loose stitches that can be easily pulled to gather the crown. Next, sew the sleeve closed and press the seam open flat. When pinning on the sleeve, I always start by matching up the underarm seam first and then the top center point at the shoulder. Then I work my way up each side of the armhole, easing in the sleeve slightly till I get to my gathering stitches. Then it's just a matter of making the gathers even before sewing it down. This pattern calls for shoulder pads, but I am not going to sew them in. I'm moving on to the lining, and basically I'm going to repeat the same process for the steps of what I just did for the front, back, side front, and side back, sewing in the stay stitching and clipping the curves. I also want to mention that you will need to clip the curve of the waist area. And here is the body of the jacket lining all ready for the sleeves, which is the same process as the jacket. So in essence, you're making 2 jackets and combining them into one. Which is now the next step, sewing the lining to the jacket, starting with the stay stitching on the neckline. But this time, instead of just sewing the neckline, you're going to sew the fronts as well. Then you will trim off the seam allowance and clip the corners. Now before I flip the jacket right side out, I'm going to sew the hem on the front just to the side front. I mark 1.5 inches up from the bottom and stitch across. Then I will trim off most of the fabric from the corner. Now it's time to turn the jacket right side out and give it a good press. One thing that you should always do when creating any kind of lined jacket is to connect the lining to the underarm and shoulder seams around the armhole. You can tack it together or sew a jump train, whatever you like. Just always make sure to connect them. Now I can hem the sleeves, and I want them to be a bit on the long side so that when I bend my arms, they don't rise up too much. And I'm shortening mine 1.5 inches. When you hem the sleeves on a jacket, you must first fold over the hem to see if the opening is the same size or just a bit larger than the sleeve itself. If it's smaller, then you need to flare the seam allowance just a bit so that your sleeve won't pucker when you sew the hem. To hem the sleeves, I sew a blind tack stitch, which means you won't see it on the other side, like the way most dress pants are hemmed. To do that, you just catch a thread or two of the jacket and then come up under the edge of the hem. I also stitch several times at the seam allowances for security. To attach the lining to the cuff, here's where your armhole tacks come in handy, by holding the sleeve lining in place as you pull down the lining to the end of the sleeve. Then you cut the lining to match the length of the sleeve. Turn under 1/2 inch and pin it close to the bottom of the hem of the cuff. This will give the lining fabric 1 inch of fullness, which helps with movement when wearing the jacket. Now stitch through the lining, and as you come out, catch the hem of the cuff and pull the thread snugly. But be sure it's not too tight that you pucker the sleeve. Now I can finish the hem of the jacket. I start by folding the center extension over with right sides together and stitch across 1.5 inches from the bottom. Trim away the extra fabric and turn the point right side out. Now I can pin and press the rest of the hem and sew it into place the same way I hemmed the cuff of the sleeves with the blind tack stitch. To finish the inner pleat detail, I mark the hem 1.5 inches up from the bottom, fold in the seam allowance at the extension, fold the hem up and in to sew a double turned hem. So that everything lays flat, I clip the seam allowance above the hem of the pleat as well as the extension. Tack the opening of the extension closed. Fold back the inner pleat and stitch through all the layers at the folded edge. To close up the lining, lay the jacket flat on your ironing board and give it a good tug to smooth out the lining. Pin just above the pleat opening and pin the lining seam allowance together to the inner pleat. Try the jacket on to make sure there isn't any puckering in the back and that it all lays nice and flat. Then fold under the hem of the lining and hand tack the lining to the center back opening of the inner pleat. For the rest of the lining hem, I am turning under the 1.5 inch seam allowance and pinning it to the jacket. Now if you don't have a mannequin at home, never fear. Just be sure to try on the jacket after pinning the lining in place so that the jacket hangs flat and there's no puckers, which I did not do, which you will soon see here in just a minute why that is so important. And I'm basically hand sewing the lining the way I sewed the lining to the sleeve cuff.
Well, we've come to the last and final step, the buttonholes, and I am really not looking forward to this. Yes, I have a really cool machine that does the whole steps, but a lot of times my buttonholes end up crooked and weird, and I'm not looking forward to this part, but it's time to finish this up.
And so I measured my button and went through the process of marking the placement of all the buttonholes. I even started to feel more confident as I went, thinking that the fabric was not too thick and should be easy enough to sew in all these buttonholes. And as I mentioned, my machine has this great 5-step process of a buttonhole maker. You just turn the dial and it zigzags down one side, stitches across the end, zigzags back up the other side, stitches across the other end, and then locks it into place. And just look how nicely these all came out, super straight and all the right size. And just as I was about to cut them open, I heard this little voice inside of my head that said, "Wait, go try on the jacket." And I'm so glad I did, because that's when I saw what could have been a royal disaster. If I button close this jacket up, the point of my detail on the front gets all messed up and is no longer in a point. I'm also noticing that my lining is puckering at the hem, as well as the hip area seems a bit too full. I'm going to need to make some adjustments by taking in the front seams as well as the side seams. I'm also going with the first instinct I had before making this jacket, and that was to add a zipper closure on the front, which I think looks very nice and goes well with the design of the jacket. I did take in the side front seams as well as the sides through the hips, which meant I had to reset the bottom of the pocket and fix the lining at the bottom. But now it's all done, and guess what? It's time for a photo shoot.
Well, that was fun, and the weather here in Florida is getting just cold enough for me to wear this jacket. You know, when I went back through the footage of when I tried on my skirt, I realized that this project is actually a Pinterest-inspired project. And the jacket that I showed in the video was this one here. But in actuality, it's closer to this jacket here. And mine is very similar to this one, but different at the same time. And so now I have a garment that I actually get to add to my Pinterest-inspired book. And I hope this video has inspired you to take on a project that might be a little outside of your skill level and challenge you to take on something that might seem to be a bit complicated. You just have to understand why things are sewn together the way that they are so that your garment will turn out correctly, and the importance of things like stay stitching and interfacing and why we do need them. So what lessons did I learn in this project? Well, I need to be very careful when cutting out my pattern pieces, that's for sure. And I need to trust my first instinct when I'm working on projects like this, because my first initial thoughts were to add a zippered closure on the front instead of the buttons. And I'm glad I hadn't cut those buttonholes open, because then the whole front of this would have been a disaster, And I'm so thankful that I listened to the voice inside of my head and I did not cut them open. It just took some time to pick out all the stitching. Another thing I need to do, and I'm usually pretty good at this when I'm making a garment, is that I do a lot of fittings as I'm putting it together to make sure I'm happy with it before I put all the finishing touches on. And this time I kind of jumped the gun a little bit after I got it finished and I was looking at the buttons and all of that detail, that I noticed that the extra seam allowance that I had added for the hip area made the jacket very full. And so I needed to slim that down. And when I pinned the lining at the hem to the jacket, I had the jacket inside out on the mannequin. It wasn't on me. And so after finishing it, it was all puckered. But that's something that was very easily fixed. The last lesson that I've learned, and I've learned this from the last several upcycle projects that I've made, and that's when I think I have enough fabric to make whatever project I'm doing in the garments that I'm using, I never have enough, and that I always have to go and search for more garments to add to my project. Because I'm not just taking a long skirt and making it short or altering something to fit me. I'm taking these garments completely apart and making something totally new out of them. And the fabric never goes as far as I think it will. Just like this jacket here. I had 4 garments that I thought there was going to be plenty of fabric, and I used every bit of fabric I could in putting this together. And I even had brand new lining to line it with. But it's all done now, and I'm super happy with the way that it turned out. And if you've made it this far in the video, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit that like button and consider subscribing to my channel as the sewing madness continues.